A breeze slips through broken windows. Dust dances in a shaft of pale sunlight. Inside the long-forgotten mansion in Beverly Hills, silence hangs thick as velvet. The once glittering home of Hollywood royalty, Rita Hayworth, stands still, its rooms haunted not by ghosts but by echoes of laughter, footsteps in satin heels, and the slow fade of a brilliant mind unraveling. Time has not been kind to this house, nor to the woman who once called it her sanctuary. Once a sanctuary of dreams, it now feels like a crypt to fading memory. Her legacy, more whispered than shouted, more mourned than understood, lingers here, shimmering in the dusty mirrors tucked into the folds of the aging curtains and trailing behind the creaks of floorboards walked by no one. Here, behind ivy-covered walls and iron gates, the love goddess fell, not in scandal, but in silence. This is the story of Rita Hayworth's rise to the heavens and her heartbreaking descent into darkness. And it's all etched into the bones of the house she left behind. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Never Had a Childhood. Rita Hayworth was born Margarita Carmen Cancino on October 17, 1918, in Brooklyn, New York. Her beauty would one day be admired around the world, but in those early years her life was far from charmed. She was the eldest child in a family shaped by struggle, ambition, and unhealed wounds. Her father, Eduardo Cancino, was a renowned Spanish dancer. He was proud and intense. Her mother, Volga Hayworth, was a former Ziegfeld Follies showgirl of Irish-English descent, soft-spoken and gentle, caught in the shadow of her husband's grand expectations. Eduardo saw in his daughter not a child to nurture, but a partner to mold. By the age of 3, Margarita was already taking dance lessons, and by 12, she was performing with her father in nightclubs across California and Mexico. What should have been a childhood filled with laughter and play was instead consumed by rehearsals, stage lights, and the relentless pursuit of perfection. Eduardo pushed her hard. Too hard. Discipline in the Cancino household was not an option. It was a way of life. There was no room for mistakes and no time for childish dreams. They danced together under the name The Dancing Cancinos, a father-daughter act that played at small-time venues and smoky cabarets. They were exotic and electrifying. But behind the sparkle of sequins and rhythm of flamenco was a girl growing up far too fast. She wore makeup and heels before she knew what adolescence meant. She moved her body to rhythms that mimicked adult sensuality before understanding what that performance implied. It was in Tijuana, in a nightclub filled with cigarette smoke and the smell of cheap perfume, where Margarita's innocence began to fray. Her father's ambitions led her into spaces meant for grown women, not teenagers. The lines between fatherly pride and obsessive control blurred and darkened. Rumors began to circulate. Rumors of inappropriate closeness, of a father's hand that lingered too long, of a daughter too obedient to refuse. The whispers were never proven, but they clung to her legacy like shadows behind a curtain. Volga, her mother, watched from the margins, helpless and worried. She tried to pull Rita away from the act, to give her a taste of normalcy, but Eduardo's grip was iron. The family was dependent on the income, and Rita, still a child, carried their fate on her narrow shoulders. By the time she was 16, desperate for independence, Margarita married Edward Judson, a businessman more than twice her age. He promised escape and opportunity. In truth, he saw her potential the way a jeweler sees a rough stone, something to be polished, rebranded, and sold. Judson convinced her to change her name. Margarita became Rita, and her mother's surname, Hayworth, replaced her Spanish heritage. She underwent painful electrolysis to raise her hairline, dyed her hair a vivid red, and shed her identity like an old costume. Hollywood didn't want a Spanish dancer. It wanted a fantasy. And Rita became that fantasy. Columbia Pictures signed her, and with studio boss Harry Cohn's heavy hand guiding her image, Rita Hayworth was born anew. But the girl behind the name, The girl who danced for approval, who never had a first kiss without an audience, who carried secrets stitched inside her satin gowns, remained hidden. Even as her star rose, Rita carried the weight of a life begun too early and shaped by the desires of others. She had become the shimmering illusion that men dreamed of, but she could never truly escape the little girl who just wanted to be seen for who she really was. Chapter 2. The House That Fame Built. By the early 1940s, Rita Hayworth was one of the most famous women in the world. Her image graced the cover of magazines, her smile was painted on the sides of military aircraft, and her every move was documented by press eager to glimpse the life of the love goddess. But beneath the glamour and behind the flashbulbs, Rita yearned for something simple: safety, serenity, and control over her own space. So she bought a home, a refuge. Nestled in Beverly Hills, the house stood at the end of a quiet street, its Tudor-style architecture stately yet unpretentious. There were no grand gates, no golden statues. Instead, a winding path lined with lavender led to an arched doorway, ivy crawling up the facade as if nature itself were trying to hold her. This was not just a house. It was her haven. Inside, the decor was elegant but understated. Earth tones, velvet drapes, soft lighting. Rita filled it with antiques, books, and music. A piano stood in the sunroom, its keys worn from quiet practice. Persian rugs softened the creak of hardwood floors. On the mantel above the fireplace, framed photographs of her parents, her daughters, and a few select friends told the story of a woman who was often alone but never entirely without love. The house quickly became a retreat from the chaos of Hollywood. She had it designed for privacy, with hedges thick enough to shield her from paparazzi lenses and neighbors' curiosity. Inside those walls, Rita removed the mask. She wore robes instead of gowns, slippers instead of heels. She cooked slowly and thoughtfully, using recipes her mother had taught her. She drank tea in the mornings, wine in the evenings. She sang softly when she thought no one could hear. It was here that she raised her daughter Yasmin, the child she had with Prince Ali Khan. Rita was fiercely protective of her. She enrolled Yasmin in local schools, kept her close, and kept the outside world at bay. The garden was their shared sanctuary. Together they planted roses, tulips, and orange trees. They spent hours under the pergola reading, laughing, simply spending mother-daughter time. In those moments, Rita seemed more herself than anywhere else. Despite its peaceful exterior, the house absorbed Rita's unrest. There were rooms she refused to enter after certain memories were made. A guest room that once belonged to Orson Welles remained untouched after their divorce. A hallway mirror was covered for years after she claimed she no longer recognized the woman reflected back. When she was between films, Rita would vanish into her home like a shadow retreating at dusk. Friends said they sometimes wouldn't hear from her for weeks. Her staff learned to be gentle with her moods. Some days she was radiant, others withdrawn. The house became a map of her emotional terrain: the sunroom for joy, the study for grief, the kitchen for solitude, the master bedroom for memory. And yet, despite the sorrow woven into its walls, the house also held her resilience. It was where she memorized scripts late into the night, where she faced heartbreaks head-on, where she tended to her ailing mother in her final days. It was where she tried again and again to believe in love. Photographers would sometimes park nearby, hoping for a glimpse of Rita in her garden, but they rarely succeeded. The house gave nothing away, just as Rita had learned. It wasn't just bricks and wood. It was her fortress, her confidant. It knew her laughter and her loneliness. It sheltered her triumphs and concealed her wounds. In that house, Rita Hayworth carved out a piece of the world where she could be more than an image. She could be a woman. And slowly, heartbreakingly, it became the one place she would never truly leave. Chapter 3. The Marriages That Unmade Her. Rita Hayworth was married 5 times. Each union, each love story seemed to start with breathless hope and end in haunting disillusion. Hollywood had labeled her the ultimate object of desire, but off-screen she longed not for admiration, but for safety, for the kind of love that wouldn't collapse under the weight of her past. Her second husband was Orson Welles. To the world he was a prodigy, charismatic and intellectually explosive, the man behind Citizen Kane. But to Rita, he was both a sanctuary and storm. Their love was immediate, intense, and electric. They spoke about everything: art, fear, identity. He saw past her constructed persona and called her Margarita, her real name. It thrilled her. It terrified her. They had a daughter, Rebecca, and for a while it seemed possible to blend their brilliance, but Orson was mercurial often, vanishing into work radio dramas or other women's arms. Rita, still healing from the possessiveness of her father and the manipulation of Judson, needed steadiness. What she got was distance. She once said, "Orson never gave me anything, not even time." When they divorced in 1948, Rita was heartbroken. But more than that, she was defeated. She withdrew from public view, retreating again into her Beverly Hills sanctuary. But it wasn't long before another suitor appeared, Prince Ali Khan. Ali was a globe-trotting playboy heir to the Aga Khan, and a man who courted Rita with relentless charm. He sent flowers, jewelry, and letters soaked in perfume and promises. She resisted at first, but something in her softened. Maybe it was the fantasy of royalty, the idea that this time she could be cherished rather than consumed. They married in 1949, and Rita became a princess. But the title didn't come with peace. Ali was rarely home, often seen at casinos or polo matches with women draped on his arm. Rita gave birth to Yasmin in 1949, and despite her hopes, Ali continued to chase distraction. She gave up her career for him, a sacrifice that was never reciprocated. Soon, she was isolated in European palaces, far from the house she had made a home. When the marriage collapsed, she returned to Hollywood bruised, not physically, but spiritually. She had tried to reinvent herself as royalty. What she got was abandonment in silk gloves. In the 1950s, desperate to reclaim her life, she returned to film and fell into the arms of singer Dick Haymes. He was troubled deeply in debt and depended on Rita, not just emotionally, but financially. Their marriage was tumultuous. There were fights, drinking, and disappearances. Rita was no longer the ingenue. She was the savior, the financier, the silent sufferer. Haymes was cruel in private, belittling her intelligence and mocking her vulnerability. She wore sunglasses not for fashion, but to hide swollen eyes. Eventually, she fled once again. Her fourth and fifth marriages were brief and quiet and never touched the depths of her earlier relationships. They were more echoes than experiences. In the wake of each divorce, Rita returned to her home. The house, always waiting, always steady, became her companion. She wandered the rooms like a woman searching for someone she used to be. The bedroom held the memory of Orson's laughter. The foyer echoed Ali's promises. The dining room had once hosted parties, now it echoed only with the clink of a single spoon in a solitary teacup. Love for Rita was both refuge and ruin. She once said, "Men fell in love with Gilda, but they woke up with me." It was her most famous quote and her saddest truth. Each marriage had chipped away at her sense of self, and in the quiet of her house, surrounded by fading photographs and unopened letters, Rita Hayworth slowly began to disappear, not from fame, but from the illusion that love could save her. Chapter 4. The Whispers of Decline. It began with small slips, forgotten appointments, misplaced jewelry, and a strange pause before delivering lines she had once memorized with ease. On set, whispers spread. Some blamed stress. Others pointed to alcohol, unaware that Rita had long moved past her youthful indulgences. The truth was more insidious, an unraveling that had nothing to do with vices and everything to do with a silent thief working inside her mind. At first she denied it. She was used to playing roles, used to faking composure. When she repeated herself or forgot names, she'd laugh it off. "I've just been working too hard," she'd say, but those closest to her housekeeper, her agent, even her daughter Yasmin, sensed something deeper, something tragic. The house, once vibrant, started to reflect her mental fog. Curtains remained closed, lights were left on all night. Rita would leave half-drunk glasses of water around the rooms and forget she had placed them there. Sometimes she'd leave the stove on. Other times she'd call for people long gone. Her mother, Orson, and even Eduardo. Yasmin, then a young woman, began visiting more often. She watched her mother struggle to find words, to finish thoughts. Once Rita looked at a photograph of Yasmin and asked, "Is she coming today?" Yasmin answered softly, "It's me, Mama. I'm right here." The worst part wasn't the forgetting. It was the flashes of clarity. When Rita knew something was wrong, when she would look in the mirror and whisper, "What's happening to me?" And Yasmin, untrained and terrified, would hold her and say, "It's okay, Mama. It's okay." Doctors offered little comfort. Alzheimer's at that time was barely understood. There was no roadmap, no treatment, only decline. Her home became her world. She rarely left, afraid of getting lost or disoriented. She no longer recognized the street names around Beverly Hills that once guided her to studios and salons. The rooms became her landscape of memory and misremembering. One night a neighbor found her wandering barefoot in the garden, staring up at the stars, repeating lines from her films. Another time she opened her door to a delivery boy and asked if he knew where Eduardo had gone. She believed he had just stepped out. Friends stopped visiting. Hollywood forgot. The invitations dried up. But the house remained, a vessel of familiarity. Its walls echoed with songs she no longer sang. Its floors groaned under her uncertain steps. Yasmin brought in full-time care, but it didn't ease the heartbreak. Rita, once so luminous, now lived in fragments. She would smile at strangers, laugh suddenly, stare at photographs for hours. She would sit in the garden and trace the leaves of rose bushes, whispering names no one else recognized. By the time her diagnosis was made official in 1981, the Rita the world knew had already begun to fade. But to Yasmin, and to the house, she was still there. In the way she touched the banister she'd held for decades, in the way she hummed old songs from her childhood, in the quiet strength behind her confusion. The decline was not sudden, it was a slow erosion of identity, and the house, like a faithful companion, bore witness to every tremor, every lapse, every ghost that entered and stayed. Chapter 5. The Final Years. After the diagnosis in 1981, Yasmin made a choice that would define the next 6 years of her life. She brought her mother to New York, away from the whispers of Hollywood, the flashbulbs, the vultures. There, in a quiet Manhattan apartment overlooking the East River, she created a world small enough for Rita to feel safe again. It wasn't glamorous. There were no premieres, no gowns, no awards. But there was warmth. There was routine. There was love. Each morning began with classical music. Rita responded to Bach the way some people respond to sunlight. She would sway gently, eyes closed, as if some part of her still danced. Yasmin would guide her through breakfast, sometimes needing to remind her how to hold a spoon. They kept the walls lined with photographs, black and white stills from her films, pictures of Yasmin as a child, a candid shot of Rita laughing with Orson unposed and free. Sometimes she'd stare at them and smile. Sometimes she'd ask, "Who is that beautiful girl?" There were good days. Rita would hum old songs, recite fragments of poems, even try on jewelry with a flicker of her old charm, but the good days became fewer, and the fog grew thicker. She began to lose language. Entire sentences collapsed into single words. She grew fearful of mirrors, unsure of who was staring back. At night she would call out for her mother, for Eduardo, for people who had long left the world but remained vivid in her unraveling mind. Yasmin never wavered. She read to her. She sang to her. She held her mother's hand through storms of confusion. Theirs became a love story of another kind. Not fiery, not tragic, but quietly heroic. As the disease progressed, Rita no longer recognized even her daughter. But she recognized love. She responded to gentleness. She found peace in the sound of Yasmin's voice. In May 1987, Rita Hayworth passed away in her sleep, surrounded by care and stillness. She was 68. The woman who had once been America's most iconic star had faded, not in scandal or spectacle, but in softness. Her funeral was small. Close friends, family, no red carpet, no press, just petals on her casket and a silence heavy with memory. But in the weeks that followed, the tributes poured in. Letters from fans, tributes from co-stars, newspaper articles revisiting her films, her beauty, her tragedy. The world remembered what it had once worshipped, but Yasmin remembered more. The woman who once danced barefoot in their garden, the mother who hummed to her before bed, the fragile, funny, brilliant soul who had simply wanted to be loved without condition. Rita had spent her life trying to escape the masks others gave her. In the end, stripped of memory, of fame, of persona, she was finally just herself. And in that final surrender, she was free. Chapter 6. What the House Knows. After Rita's death, her beloved Beverly Hills estate stood in a kind of suspended animation. The lush garden that had once bloomed with her laughter grew wild and untamed. Ivy crept further up the stone walls as if nature was trying to reclaim what Rita had once tried to preserve. The shutters sagged. The fountain in the courtyard, once bubbling with life, lay dry and cracked. The house became quiet. Eerily so, neighbors noted the stillness. There were no more deliveries, no housekeepers, no music drifting through the open windows. Some said it felt as though the house had gone into mourning. Others whispered that it had always been mourning. Long before Rita's body gave out, the house had already started grieving her slow disappearance. Inside, nothing was staged. The furniture remained where it had been left. A shawl was still draped over the back of the reading chair. A teacup sat in the sink. In her dressing room, half-used lipstick tubes stood silently on the vanity. Her perfume, a delicate gardenia, lingered in the air like an echo refusing to fade. Visitors spoke of the strange weight in the rooms. Realtors who came to assess the property described the house as haunted, not by spirits but by something heavier, grief, perhaps, or memory. Some claimed to hear music at night, soft jazz barely audible, like it came from the record player she once loved. Others felt sudden drafts as if someone had just walked by. Whether these were true hauntings or simply the imagination of those who knew her story didn't matter. The house had absorbed her essence. It remembered. When it was eventually put on the market, it drew more curiosity seekers than serious buyers. Hollywood had moved on. The studios that once adored her now courted newer, louder stars. Her home, much like her legacy, was caught between reverence and forgetting. But to those who truly knew her, to the few who still visited, leaving flowers at the iron gate, it was sacred ground. A temple to a woman who had given everything to a world that had both celebrated and devoured her. The house stood not as a relic, but as a witness. It had seen her joy, her sorrow, her fury, her peace. It had seen her at her most radiant and her most fragile, and in the quiet that followed her absence it became a mirror, not just of Rita Hayworth, but of all women who had ever been adored and misunderstood in equal measure. Chapter 7. A Legacy Beyond the Light. Rita Hayworth's final years may have faded into the quiet of illness, but her legacy remained persistent, like a melody that continues to play after the lights have dimmed. After her death, Yasmin made it her mission to transform her mother's suffering into purpose. She founded the Rita Hayworth Gala in New York and later in Chicago, raising millions for the Alzheimer's Association. What had once been a source of shame and silence became a banner of awareness. Rita's name was no longer just attached to seduction or silver screens. It was tied to science, to advocacy, to hope. But Rita's legacy lived in more than gala invitations and research grants. It lived in celluloid, in the sway of her hips in Gilda, in the longing glances of her characters and the flash of pain behind her laughter. Film students still pause at her performances, marveling at her magnetism. But those who look closer see more than beauty. They see ache. They see a woman trying to hold herself together under the weight of becoming everyone's fantasy, but no one's reality. She was, perhaps, the most tragic of all Golden Age stars, not for her downfall, but for how completely she gave herself away, to the screen, to men, to the idea of who she should be. Her estate, long since sold, remains a symbol, an emblem of both grandeur and grief. Like so many stars of her era, her life was orchestrated, her desires edited out of the final cut. But time, slow and forgiving, has begun to return to her what was once taken. Today, she is remembered with tenderness. Documentaries revisit her brilliance, actresses cite her as inspiration, and older fans still speak her name with a reverence that suggests they saw through the illusion, even back then. Rita Hayworth did not vanish. She transcended. She lives in the way the light hits a ballroom floor, in the tremble of a song half remembered, in the whisper of satin across marble. She lives in the stories told in quiet rooms where the truth matters more than the image. And in the empty house that once held her laughter, she lingers still.